Firstly, I would like to thank the organizing committee of this wonderful and very informative meeting, and all speakers and participants as well. I believe that the discussions and presentations in this meeting will be a turning point for archaeology in Turkey, and they will be good reference to initiate new research in the future. Today, I will present part of my master's thesis, in which through a qualitative discourse analysis, I am investigating how sex, gender, sexuality are interpreted in Turkish archaeology and ancient historiography. I'm still on the process of completing thesis, therefore, I would be very happy if you could share your opinions and comments at the end. Also, I think Sarah's presentation was a great summary, and she has already drawn a very crucial background. And my presentation will support the point that Sarah has already indicated. Just for a brief outline, today I want to highlight the importance of directing sociolinguistic questions to archaeology. I will briefly explain discourse and critical discourse analysis. I will summarize the main studies connecting gender archaeology with discourse analysis. Regarding this, I will present a brief case study from the findings of my thesis, and I will introduce how sex, gender, sexuality are interpreted in Turkish archaeology. Then I will conclude and state my opinions for the future directions. I'm sure that here everyone is aware of this, but just to remind, today archaeologists communicate their findings by producing knowledge in various platforms, such as academic publications, media, or museums. To me, the most important tool that archaeologists use is not a trowel or a small pick, but I think it is language. So it is important to uncover the contribution of archaeologists themselves to the process of knowledge production, rather than simply uncovering the reality in the past acquired through material culture. It is also crucial to remind that language is not a neutral tool for communication. Rather, it is interactive and constructive, so it can be accepted as a site where meanings and interpretations are constantly recreated and changed. And this leads us to the appearances of discourses, which I will mention a bit later. By keeping language as interactive and constructive in our minds, it wouldn't be so difficult to understand that language in use is everywhere and always political. Here, being political implies anything and any place in which human social interactions determine how the sources of power, status, or words are defined and distributed. By this way, the language that archaeologists use is intertwined with lots of issues related to power relations. Just for one very familiar example, the usages of archaeology in the constructions of nation states, as it was also the case in Turkey. In his book titled Archaeology and Modernity, Julian Thomas states that archaeology is creatively shaped by its contemporary cultural and linguistic sources. Of course, the professional language of any discipline, including archaeology, also contributes to the creation of an academic culture and determines what a discipline looks like. In the field of academic research, textual production is at the core of negotiating the relationship between the members of academic communities and of constructions of academic identities. I like this GIF very much because I think it summarizes what I mean by language in use in archaeology. Here we can follow how the field work actually transforms into different social interactions that you cannot even realize all of them. Now we can look at what discourse is. Today, discourse is a very popular word. It is used even in daily language. However, people might use this word in appropriate contexts or with other concepts, such as ideology, interchangeably. Besides, scholars treat discourse differently. And for example, they can refer to a form of language or describe particular philosophies that work for language usages in the background. Also, diverse fields such as philosophy and linguistics have defined discourse. As a conclusion, it is very controversial. There are various definitions and understandings of discourse, and I will not summarize all of them. Instead, it can be generally defined as the study of language as it is used in society, expressed either through speaking or writing. And there are two main aspects of discourse and discourse analysis. First, context is significant, and it can be defined as certain times, places, and circumstances in which languages establish social interactions. Another aspect is intertextuality, which means that discourses in the same context interact with other discourses. So discourses often influence each other, and they sometimes come together to create new hybrids. If we accept discourse analysis as an umbrella term, there are also several types of discourse analysis under this term. One of them is critical discourse analysis, which started in Europe, especially in the United Kingdom, and began to rise in the late 1970s. Critical discourse analysis is fed by the critical social theory. For example, Gramsci's theorization about internalized hegemony based on coercion and consent. Besides, Bourdieu's notion of habitus and Habermas' stress on the role of communication in modern societies contribute to these critical approaches. Critical discourse analysis also owes a particular depth to Foucault in terms of theorizations of power. So to differentiate critical discourse analysis from other discourse analysis, we should know that it contains one essential approach, a political concern regarding power in society and a specific interest in how language contributes to power operations. Parallel to the appearance of critical discourse analysis, the studies covering language and gender also started to change after the 1970s. Previously, the research combining gender and language is connected with the difference-based explanations, which refer to the idea that men and women use different languages. But over time, such studies started to have a more inclusive understanding about gender and language, thanks to the effects of critical feminisms. While there have been lots of studies from a feminist perspective within critical discourse analysis, another new subtitle, Feminist Critical Discourse Analysis, was proposed by Michelle Lazar in 2005. The mission of feminist critical discourse analysis, according to her, becomes to examine how power and dominance about gender are discursively produced, resisted, and counter-resisted in a variety of ways through textual representations or interactional talk strategies. But did this discussion also influence archaeological research? Of course, there are various studies concerning the language in archaeology. Here you can see these two books that can be seen as fundamental about this issue. The first one is written by our dear keynote speaker. Here she explores how archaeological languages are created, and archaeologists give authority to particular voices over others. Joyce uses the work of Mikhail Bakhtin and his analysis of the construction of human language. In addition to Joyce's book, the Archaeology of Semiotics is another source bringing linguistic theories into archaeology. In this book, Purcell explains the relationship between materials and meanings through the studies of two founding semioticians, Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles Peirce. However, the connection between language, gender, and archaeology is much less studied. Nevertheless, there are some important works For instance, the 2007 volume of the Journal of Archaeological Methods and Theory was a major contribution to the discussions about the perception of gender in archaeology. In this volume, Conkey reviewed the contents of 4 readers of archaeological theory to question how the discipline considers feminist theory. Conkey finds that women theorists are underrepresented in such readers. Later on, Bagdanielson demonstrates that gender-themed articles constitute only 2% of the total number of published archaeological articles across 81 journals. There are also some studies about citation practices in archaeology regarding sexes of authors. For example, Hudson examines citation practices in 4 journals to discover whether female scholars are cited less. And very recently, in her PhD thesis, Deluyin presents a detailed research for the impact of gender studies in archaeology. She applies the methods of corpus linguistics to research articles of 6 prominent archaeological journals, and she finds that gender still refers to women in archaeology, and it is marginalized. These main studies that cover language, gender, and archaeology, as presented, however, are mainly quantitative, and they are insufficient to address how discourses about gender, which are produced by archaeologists, are intertwined with sociopolitical aspects. In other words, the context in which they are produced. So in my master's thesis, I have analyzed 50 academic publications, including books, journal articles, and symposium or conference papers written in Turkish by archaeologists and historians who are native Turkish speakers. The selection of the publications was done according to the gender-related keywords that are used in the titles of publications. In the chart on the left-hand side, you can see these words in Turkish, and as you can realize, the number of women, kadın, as a word is very high. On the right-hand side, you see the categorization of these selected publications based on the publication dates from 1950s to 2020. This actually shows that the academic interest in gender increased in the last decade in Turkey. As the findings of the analysis, I attempt to order and categorize some common discursive subjects and patterns, as well as to discuss them with their sociopolitical context. I will randomly explain some of them without giving any specific examples because of the time limits. The first striking pattern is the interpreting women's long-running civil rights and high social status in Anatolia. The publications in my corpus mostly highlight women's rights and freedom that are shaped within the framework of property, marriage, and nuclear family. In other words, the civil rights of women. Another pattern appears when Anatolia is compared with surrounding cultures in terms of gender issues. This comparison method is particularly used to argue that the situation in Anatolia is rather favorable or better in terms of women's rights and gender equality in the past. I think that these first two subjects are directly related to the construction of Turkey's national identity through the emphasis on civil rights and emancipation of women, as well as considering Turkey as the last generation ring of the Anatolian civilizations and their high culture. By this way, the case of women in national discourses is connected with the status of women in the past of Anatolia. From the corpus, another commonly discussed subject is the transition from matriarchal to patriarchal social order. Matriarchy is usually represented as an order in which women and men are equally positioned in remote past. I define this depiction as nostalgia since several, but only female scholars, sometimes associate matriarchy with love, peace, and solidarity. In other words, positive attributes. While discussing powerful women such as queens also provide some interesting results. Although at the beginning I decided to focus on archaeology-based texts, I have realized that discussing gender, particularly women, usually occur based on written sources. Therefore, I have decided to add history-based publications too. But the problem is that most archaeologists and historians who look at these documents uncritically approve the patriarchal perception of women embedded in the language of ancient authors. As a result, we encounter the depiction of powerful women as idealized because of their characteristics such as loyalty, motherhood, and honor, and sometimes otherized because they cause conspiracies or chaos in palaces. When it comes to interpreting gender, finally, binary thinking gathers around the idea that men and women as separate entities, but complementary opposites. It is important to realize that such thinking prefigures men and women to have nothing in common. In the selected publications, I generally observe that women are usually defined against men with stereotypic understandings, and the sexual aspects of women in prehistoric and ancient period are also connected with reproduction and giving birth. Of course, this supports heteronormativity. As a conclusion, the critical discourse analysis shows that in archaeology, interpreting gender occurs in the light of personal interests, institutional interests, and disciplinary interests about the past. And this constitutes an important reason to become more self-reflexive for gender archaeology in Turkey. Here, I want to open a parenthesis to explain self-reflexivity for those who are not familiar with it. Self-reflexivity in archaeology means that the interpretation process and production of archaeological knowledge are reflected on while in progress by the person creating this knowledge. In other words, like being reflected in a mirror, to be reflexive is to have something directed back on oneself. Secondly, it can be concluded that in Turkish archaeology, in ancient historiography, gender actually means woman, as previous studies have already discussed. And this leads us to the idea that men are the norm, while women are considered exotic and the ones having sex, gender, sexuality. Finally, in Turkey, interpreting gender in archaeology can be associated with the sociopolitical aspects and the paradigms of nationalism. As a final question, I also ask this: does interpreting gender make peace with feminism? From the analysis, I observed that although Turkish archaeology and ancient historiography have the potential, they seem to have potential to produce feminist discourses, recent discussions in feminism, third and fourth waves, are otherized because of the ideological and academic framework in which these disciplines are situated. To elaborate more, it wouldn't be wrong to claim that feminism is being meticulously and intentionally selected in these disciplines in Turkey. So, in my opinion, So, in my opinion, there's still a need for more studies on how various factors, such as feminism, academic structures, and the efforts of individual scholars involved in the proliferation of gender-related studies in archaeology. I said except the West, because studies on the history of gender archaeology is still limited in the world, as Sarah has also shown. Unfortunately, such discussions are still dominated by the Western scholarship, and we do not know much about other parts of the world. I also think that more studies should be done about the representations and constructions of masculinities in archaeology in order to deconstruct man equals to norm, and more sociolinguistic studies in disciplinary contexts are necessary. For example, the language of female and male archaeologists in the fieldwork to question what is in common in their language in use. And finally, in archaeological research, the experiences of marginalized people, such as women and non-heterosexuals, should be questioned and analyzed. Here I just put a preliminary bibliography section. If you would like to read more on this subject, you can contact me anytime you want. Thank you so much for listening.